Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahaviryan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhi Tamastu Mavitvisha Vahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. This looks okay. Good. Welcome to you. Welcome to our weekly class on the Bhagavad Gita. We've been studying Chapter 6 on meditation for some weeks now, and we're actually coming today to the end of Chapter 6. We'll see how far we get. We'll begin, as always, with some chanting. There we go. And just to set the context, here Sri Krishna, this is verse 41, and here Sri Krishna is responding to Arjuna's question. You remember from the prior class, Arjuna asked, what happens to a yogi, a meditator, who is deeply engaged in spiritual practice his or her whole life, but fails to reach enlightenment in that lifetime? So that Arjuna's question is about the yoga bhrashta. Bhrashta, fallen. So what happens to one who is yoga bhrashta, fallen from yoga? And we see Sri Krishna's response, which will conclude the chapter. And as always, as I'm chanting, be sure you look at the meaning. So the meaning is in your mind, and then repeat after me. Shri Bhagavanu Vacha, Shri Bhagavanu Vacha, Partha Naiveha Namutra, Partha Naiveha Namutra, Vinashastasya Vidyate, Vinashastasya Vidyate, Nahi Kalyana Krit Kaschat, Nahi Kalyana Krit Kaschat, Durgatim Tata Gacchati, Durgatim Tata Gacchati, Prapya Punya Kritam Lokan, Prapya Punya Kritam Lokan, Ushitva Shashwati Samaha, Ushitva Shashwati Samaha, Shuchi Nam Shrimatam Gehe, Shuchi Nam Shrimatam Gehe, Yoga Bhrashto Bhijayate, Yoga Bhrashto Bhijayate, Atava Yoginam Eva, Atava Yoginam Eva, Kule Bhavati Dhimatam, Kule Bhavati Dhimatam, Etadhi Durlabhataram, Etadhi Durlabhataram, Loke Janma Yaridrisham, Loke Janma Yaridrisham, Tatratam Buddhi Samyogam, Tatratam Buddhi Samyogam, Labhate Paurvadehikam, Labhate Paurvadehikam, Yatate Chatato Bhuyaha, Yatate Chatato Bhuyaha, Samsiddhau Kuru Nandana, Samsiddhau Kuru Nandana, Purvabhyasena tenaiva, Purvabhyasena tenaiva, Hriyate hyavashopi saha, Hriyate hyavashopi saha, Jignasurapi yogasya, Jignasurapi yogasya, Shabda Brahmati vartate, Shabda Brahmati vartate, Prayatnat yatamanastu, Prayatnat yatamanastu, Yogi samshuddha kilbishaha, Yogi samshuddha kilbishaha, Aneka janma samsiddhas, Aneka janma samsiddhas, Tato yati param gatim, tato yati param gatim. Tapisvibhyodiko yogi, tapisvibhyodiko yogi, jnanibhyopi matodhikaha, jnanibhyopi matodhikaha, karmibhyaschadiko yogi, karmibhyaschadiko yogi, tasmad yogi bhavarjuna, tasmad yogi bhavarjuna, yogi namapi sarvesham, yogi namapi sarvesham, madgatenantaratmana, madgatenantaratmana, shraddhavan bhajate yomam, shraddhavan bhajate yomam, same yuktatamo mataha, same yuktatamo mataha. And that's the last verse of the chapter. And we're finishing verse 40 in the prior verse. So just to set up the our study today, to set the context, when Arjuna asks what happens to that yoga bhrashta who passes away before gaining enlightenment, in verse 40, Sri Krishna assures Arjuna that no effort in life is ever wasted. No effort in life is ever wasted, which means all of that intense sadhana, spiritual practice done by the practitioner, that will not be wasted. Why? And we said in our last class 2 reasons, and we're going to see those 2 reasons in some detail today. The 2 reasons were karma and samskara. Karma means that this yogi, this meditator, had invested so much effort in spiritual practice that spiritual practice is karma, not karma yoga, but meditation is a manasa karma, for example, a mental action. And every karma must bear its results. And as you remember from the doctrine of karma, those results are twofold, drishtapala and adrishtapala. Drishtapala are the results of a karma that take place immediately, now, according to the laws of science, and adrishtapala are results that fructify at a later time. Those results remain pending for some period of time, and at some later time, those results occur. That adrishtapala is what we loosely refer to as karma. So for that practitioner, because of all of his or her efforts in this life, he or she has accumulated so much good karma, which will be a blessing, if not in this life, they're passing away, so it will be a blessing in future lives, perhaps in the very next life. We'll see how Sri Krishna explains that. So karma is one of the 2 reasons Sri Krishna tells Arjuna here not to, that nothing is wasted. The second reason is samskara. Samskara, as I explained briefly in the last class, is a mental impression, and it is believed that some of these samskaras, not all, some samskaras, if they are deep enough, if the impression on one's mind is strong enough, they may carry along with a person through the process of reincarnation and be present in the immediate succeeding life. Which is to say, if someone, I gave the example, famous example in a prior class, I gave of the child prodigy, how to explain a child prodigy. Someone who is playing music at such a high level when at a young age of 7 or 8. I gave the example of Mozart. in last week's class. Well, one way of explaining that is that in the immediately preceding life, a very strong samskara was formed, and that samskara carried along through the process of rebirth and becomes manifest in the next life. So Sri Krishna is going to refer to both samskara and karma in explaining why the yoga bhrashta has not wasted any efforts. All of those efforts will bear fruit in later lives. We'll see how Sri Krishna explains that now. Prapya punya kritan lokan, prapya punya kritan lokan, ushitva shashwati samaha, ushitva shashwati samaha, shuchinam shrimatam gehe, shuchinam shrimatam gehe, yoga bhrashto bhijayate, yoga bhrashto bhijayate. So, what happens to the yoga bhrashta after he or she dies, failing to reach enlightenment? Prapya, having attained lokan, heavenly worlds, punya kritan, in fact, punya kritan, born of punya karma, born of good karma, that's where you get this sense of heavenly. So, prapya punya kritan lokan, having gained heavenly worlds, having gone to some heavenly loka, some heavenly realm, ushatva, and having dwelt there in those heavenly realms for shashwatihi samaha. Samaha, years. How many years? Shashwatihi, countless years. Having enjoyed heavenly realms for countless years, then what? In the third line, yoga bhrashtaha, that practitioner of yoga, meditation, who failed to get enlightenment in this life, what happens to that person? Abhijayate. After dwelling in heaven, for you all know the doctrine of karma we've discussed before. Heaven in the Hindu worldview is not a permanent condition, but a temporary condition you get to enjoy as a result of your accumulated good karmas. But then after those accumulated good karmas are used up, so to speak, exhausted, then you get reborn from heaven. And that's what he says in the third line. Yoga bhrashtaha abhijayate. Abhijayate is then reborn, leaving heaven and getting reborn where? In the third line, gehe, in the home of those who are shuchinam, of those who are pure, and shrimatam, those who are prosperous, into a pious and prosperous home. If you're born, interesting that Sri Krishna uses both of these terms. If you're born into a pious home that's poor, in one way that's good, in one way it's not good. If you're born into a prosperous home that's very impure, very impious, you can see the defects there as well. So significantly, he says, the best case scenario is to be reborn into a home to a family that is both pious and prosperous. But there's something even better than that, which Sri Krishna says in the next verse. So as a result of good karma, you could get born into that pious and prosperous home, or even better than that, atava yoginam heva, atava yoginam heva, kule bhavati dhimatam, kule bhavati dhimatam, etadhi durlabhataram, etadhi durlabhataram, loke janmayadidrisham, loke janmayadidrisham. What could be better than being born into a pious and prosperous home? Atava, or you could get born in the second line, bhavati here. He has a sense of getting born. Or you could get born, kule, in the second line, into a family of, what kind of family? Yogi nam eva, a family of yogis. Again, yogi here would mean spiritual aspirant. Our current context is meditation. So in a very strict sense, yogi nam would mean meditators, to be born into a family of meditators who are, at the end of the second line, dhimatam, wise, or even enlightened. To be born into a pious and prosperous home is good, but to be reborn into a family of enlightened meditators, nothing could be better than that, and that's exactly what Sri Krishna says here. Etat indeed, etat, this, drop down to the final line. Etat janma, this birth, yadidrasham, this kind of birth, is durlabhataram, the most difficult to obtain, loke, in the world. The most difficult to obtain means the best of all possible scenarios. Best case scenario, as we like to say, is to be born into a family of yogis. That, by the way, there's something that happens in India occasionally where a child will be lost or orphaned and will be adopted by a sannyasi, a Hindu monk, or sometimes a group of sannyasis, Hindu monks. And that child will be raised in an ashram, attending all kinds of spiritual discourses, doing puja and prayer every day, engaged in meditation from a young age onwards. So that comes close to the idea. Imagine what would be the life for that child, adopted by Hindu monks and raised up in an ashram. What a unique scenario that would be. Presuming, of course, that the sannyasis knew how to raise children properly and allowed the child to enjoy childhood properly. So that would be an example of this best case scenario. So these two verses describe the blessings to the yoga bhrashta, to the one who failed to get enlightenment in one's lifetime, the blessings that come as a result of karma. Karma, action, effort, in particular, the effort of spiritual practice. Now, in the next verse, Sri Krishna is going to talk about the benefits that come as a result of samskara, the mental impressions, which were the second kind of benefit that would carry over after the end of one's life. We'll see that. Tatratam buddhi samyogam, tatratam buddhi samyogam, labhate paurvadehikam, labhate paurvadehikam, yatate chatato bhuyaha, yatate chatato bhuyaha, samsiddhau kuru nandana, samsiddhau kuru nandana. Remember the context here. The yoga bhrashta is, after dwelling in heaven, is born either into a family that's pious and prosperous, or born into a family of yogis. So having achieved that really unique birth, then what happens? Tatra, there, in that birth, in a pious and prosperous family, or in a family of yogis, tatra, in that family, second line, labhate, that yoga bhrashta labhate will gain. That person being reborn, labhate will gain. First line, tam buddhi samyogam. That person will gain some yoga connection with the buddhi, tam buddhi, with that wisdom. Buddhi here means wisdom. tam buddhi, that will gain connection with all that wisdom which was paurva dehikam. That which was gained, the wisdom which was gained in a paurva, prior dehikam, in a prior body, in a prior life. I'll paraphrase. That yogi, failing to get enlightenment, after dwelling in heaven, will get reborn into a pious and prosperous home, or reborn into a family of yogis, and then that yogi, labate, will regain buddhi samyogam, the connection with the wisdom, paurva dehikam, he or she had in the prior life. Here Sri Krishna is clearly referring to samskara. To be reconnected to that wisdom, let's be very clear here. To get reconnected to the wisdom means to get back on the path to that wisdom. It's not that that wisdom will suddenly pop up. Remember, we've said that memories, and this is a little important, specific memories cannot be conveyed from one life to the next, because we know from modern neuroscience that memories are stored in your brain cells, in your neurons, in the connections between neurons. Those neurons do not survive death. Therefore, specific memories cannot survive death. We're not talking about specific memories. We're talking about samskara here, mental impression. Let me use a different word. This samskara suggests a kind of momentum in life that can carry over from one life to the next. Like in our musician example, someone whose momentum in life was in music. That person might be a child prodigy in music in a later life. Here we're talking about a spiritual momentum. If you had a spiritual momentum in a prior life, that momentum can carry you forward in a future life. Not that the prior wisdom is somehow going to be remembered, but that the momentum carries you forward towards enlightenment, towards spiritual wisdom. That's what the second half of the verse says exactly. Yatate cha tataha, cha tataha, cha tataha. And thereafter, so after being born in that pious and prosperous family, or after being reborn into a family of yogis, tataha, thereafter, bhuyaha, once again, yatate, that person will strive samsiddhau, for perfection, for moksha, for liberation. That samskara will lead the person to pick up the thread, so to speak, or the momentum will carry that person forward to resume that spiritual journey. If you're on a spiritual journey in the prior life, there's so much momentum gained through the process of that journey that the momentum will help this person pick up that path again and resume the spiritual journey in the next life. And Sri Krishna explains that in more detail here. He says, Purvabhyasena tenaiva, Purvabhyasena tenaiva, Hriyate hyavashopisaha, Hriyate hyavashopisaha, Jignasurapi yogasya, Jignasurapi yogasya, Shabda brahmati vartate, Shabda brahmati vartate. Sorry. So, purva abhyasena tena eva, breaking the words apart, tena, by that, by what? Purva abhyasena. Purva abhyasa, prior practice. Due to the prior practice in the previous lifetime due to the efforts made in spiritual practice in the prior lifetime, due to that momentum gained traveling that spiritual path in the prior lifetime. Sri Krishna says that Hriyate hi avashaha, avashaha, certainly, he, indeed, breaking the words apart, saha, that person, that yoga brashta, will hriyate, what a wonderful choice of words, hriyate, be carried along, avashaha, literally, helplessly. That person will be helplessly swept along. I'm being quite literal here. That person will be helplessly swept along in a positive direction towards spiritual growth, to regain that spiritual path. So the momentum from traveling that path of spiritual growth in a prior lifetime, avashaha hriyate, that aspirant, that person will be helplessly carried forward on that same path, which means it's inevitable. According to Sri Krishna, it is inevitable that that person will resume the process of spiritual growth in a future lifetime. And we'll see the result of that. We'll see in the next verse. Jignasuhu api yogasya. A jignasuhu is one who wants to know. And we're talking here about the reborn yoga brashta. So this person in their next life, born in a family of yogis or born in a pious and prosperous home, that person who has picked up the thread and resumed their process of spiritual growth in the next life, that jignasuhu, that seeker of what? Yogasya. And remember in this chapter 6, yoga mostly means meditation. That seeker of yogic wisdom, this translation is fine. That seeker of yogic wisdom, what about that person? Excuse me. Shabda Brahma ati vartate. That person, ati vartate, transcends, goes beyond Shabda Brahma. And this expression requires some explanation. Shabda Brahma, Brahman in the form of Shabda, and it's a technical expression. Shabda means words. Brahman in the form of words means what? It's a technical expression used to refer to the Vedic scriptures, the Vedas. And in particular, the reference here is not to the Vedas in general, but to the rituals of the Vedas. Of course, the Vedas is something you may not have thought about, is the Vedas are mostly dedicated to prayer and ritual. Now, as followers of Vedanta, we concern ourselves mostly with a tiny portion of the Vedas called Upanishad. But the Upanishads, which are part of the Vedas, are just the smallest part. The vast majority of the Vedic scriptures are devoted to prayer and rituals and meditation and devotional meditations. So, when Sri Krishna says here that this seeker of yogic wisdom who has been reborn in the following life will ativartate, will transcend Shabda Brahma, will transcend Vedic scriptures specifically, will transcend the ritualism of the Vedas. We have to understand that properly. If you're born in a pious home, you might be focused on doing rituals. Even if you're born in a family of yogis, it might be a family of yogis who's focused on rituals. But here, Sri Krishna makes it very clear. No, this person will transcend the ritualism of the Vedas and thereby proceed on the path of spiritual growth. There's one more verse in which Sri Krishna describes the outcome for that yoga bhrashta, for that intense spiritual aspirant, who fails to gain enlightenment, who is carried forth by the momentum of their spiritual journey to pick up the thread in a later life. And what happens to that person? Sri Krishna says, Prayatnad yatamanastu, Prayatnad yatamanastu, Yogi samshuddha kilvishaha, Yogi samshuddha kilvishaha, Aneka janma samsiddhas, Aneka janma samsiddhas, Tato yati param gatim, Tato yati param gatim. Start in the second line. Yogi, that meditator who has picked up the thread due to the momentum of following the spiritual path in a prior life, picking up the thread, being literally swept along towards that goal of spiritual growth in the later life. That yogi could be meditator in the context of chapter 6, who is samshuddha kilvishaha. Kilvisha is a word often used for sin. Samshuddha kilvisha, freed from sin. Of course, in the given context, kilvisha can also refer to ignorance. In fact, it was Swami Vivekananda who famously said, there is no sin except for ignorance. He said in a certain context that ignorance is the mother of all sins, so to speak. And what that means is that all adharmic activity has its roots in ignorance. So we can see the connection to ignorance and sinful behavior. You can imagine that someone who's enlightened will have no possible motivation to engage in sinful behavior. But sinful behavior, we know, is driven when we fail to appreciate our own inner divinity, our innate fullness and completeness. Then, due to that ignorance, mistakenly assuming that your happiness and contentment depends on so many external things, that can lead to raga and dvesha, these compulsions, which can then drive you forward into adharmic, sinful activity. So this yogi is samshuddha kilvishahi. You could translate it freed from sins, but you could also translate it freed from ignorance of your true nature. How was that person freed from ignorance? In the first line, prayatnat, through effort, through spiritual practice. And that spiritual practice includes meditation, the topic of our current chapter. So prayatnat, through spiritual practice, including the practice, by the way, including means not only the practice of meditation, but spiritual practice that includes meditation. Prayatnat, through that effort, yatamanaha but yatamanaha, continuing to strive. Here's our momentum. So that person was yatamanaha, striving hard in the prior life, and that momentum swept him or her forward in the next life to pick up the thread, to continue that spiritual journey, and to continue striving, yatamanaha. And then finally, in the third line, aneka janma samsiddhaha. That person becomes samsiddhaha, perfected, meaning enlightened, liberated, becomes perfected aneka janma, after many births. Now, there's a common misconception here. You've heard it said many times that it may require many, many births to become enlightened, especially in Buddhist tradition. There are many, many scriptures which describe how just life after life after life after life. But that's also accepted in the Hindu tradition as well. And that is, it may take many, many lives to get enlightened, and Sri Krishna is referring to that here. But the confusion I referred to is this. When someone says, oh, it's going to take so many births to get enlightened, so many births engaged in spiritual practice to get enlightened, that's fine. It may take many, many lifetimes of spiritual practice to become enlightened. But how do you know that those lifetimes of spiritual practice are yet to come? Perhaps you've already lived those many lives of spiritual practice, and that momentum has taken you up to the present time. This is discussed by Shankaracharya and others in their texts. And what they say is the very fact that you are deeply engaged in a process of spiritual growth in this life suggests that you've already had many prior lifetimes of spiritual practice. Otherwise, you wouldn't have arrived at the point where you are today, deeply engaged in spiritual practice. So aneka janma, after many lifetimes of spiritual practice, this yoga bhrashta finally becomes samsiddhaha, becomes enlightened. Tataha, and thereafter, yati, reaches param gatim, the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal in the sense that after gaining enlightenment, there's no further rebirth. And no further rebirth means not being born into any form where you're subject to suffering. So being free from rebirth means being freed from any possibility of future suffering. And then param gatim, the ultimate goal, the ultimate reality we call Brahman, that enlightened person at the time of death, instead of being reborn, remains in a condition utterly non-separate from Brahman. When you have a body and mind, that body and mind create a feeling of individuality, a feeling of separateness. After that body and mind fall away, there's nothing to create that feeling of separateness. So what remains is the enlightened person. We use the term merge into Brahman, and that's a beautiful way of expressing it, but it's a little problematic, because when you say you merge into Brahman, merge means before you were separate, now you are merged, you are non-separate. But that's actually incorrect. The enlightened person was merged in Brahman before death, merged in Brahman after death. The enlightened person was never separate from Brahman in terms of understanding. Then what is this merging thing? When you remove the sense of separation due to the body and mind, in the absence of the sense of separation due to body and mind, it feels like you're merging. That's a little abstract. You may know this experience when you fall asleep. As you fall asleep, you may have had the feeling of merging with something very vast. It's not an uncommon experience. As you drift off to sleep, in those few moments before you fall asleep, you feel yourself merging into vastness. Well, it's not that you're merging into anything, but rather that your awareness of your body and mind is going away. When your body and mind are present, you feel separate, you feel individual. When your awareness of the body and mind go away, that sense of individuality fades away. The sense of separateness fades away. And that's a more accurate way to describe this sense of merging into Brahman. There's no actual merging. What there is the loss of any sense of separation. And when the body and mind finally fall, for the enlightened person, that is the ultimate loss of separation. Loss of separation means one remains in a state of utter union or identity. Okay, how are we doing on time? Not bad. With this verse, we end Sri Krishna's discussion of the yoga bhrashta. Remember, bhrashta means fallen from yoga, meditation. We're talking about the meditator who strives very hard but fails to get enlightenment in one's lifetime. There are just two more verses in the end of the chapter in which Sri Krishna praises the yogi, and yogi here means meditator. Let's see those verses. By the way, you see my software is not handling a certain character here. In the Devanagari, there's a character bhya. The half bhya is not showing up properly on the screen. Yeah, it's okay. You can understand. Tapasvibhyodhiko yogi, tapasvibhyodhiko yogi, jnanibhyopi matodhikaha, jnanibhyopi matodhikaha, karmibhyaschadiko yogi, karmibhyaschadiko yogi, tasmad yogi bhavarjuna, tasmad yogi bhavarjuna. So wherever you see that caret, I think that's what they call that character, or whatever you call it, you have to replace it with bhya. Anyway, we'll see the verse now. So here Sri Krishna praises the yogi, and remember yogi in chapter 6 means meditator. Sri Krishna says that yogi is adhikaha, superior to whom? Tapisvabhyaha, to those who perform tapas, those who perform austerities, those who do deep penance. So the yogi is superior to those ascetics who are engaged in various kinds of penance and austerities. And further, that yogi, mataha, is considered, in the second line, mataha api also, that yogi, mataha, is considered adhikaha, better than, superior to whom? Jnanibhyaha, the wise. Now, I'm smiling here because there's something amusing going on. Here Sri Krishna says the yogi is better than ascetics. The yogi is better than the wise. Look at the next line. Yogi, karmibhyaha cha adhikaha. Breaking the words apart. The yogi is adhikaha, superior to karmibhyaha, those who perform rituals, those who are engaged in rituals, or those who are performing karma yoga. You can get that meaning out of the verse as well. So I'm smiling because here in chapter 6, Sri Krishna praises the meditators as being better than those who perform other kinds of spiritual practice. But be careful here, because back in chapter 2, Sri Krishna praised those who pursued knowledge as being better than all other spiritual paths. Then in chapter 3, Sri Krishna praised those who follow karma yoga as being better than those engaged in other spiritual practices. Then in chapter 5, Sri Krishna praised those who follow sannyasa, renunciation, as being better than those who engaged in other spiritual practices. Later, we'll see in chapter 12, Bhakti Yoga, where Sri Krishna praises those who follow the path of those engaged in devotional practices. Sri Krishna will say that they're better than anyone else. You see what's going on here? In each, depending on what the chapter is focused on, Sri Krishna will praise that subject matter. So Sri Krishna says that meditators are best, the wise are best, practitioners of karma yoga are best, the ones who have devotional practices are best, those who renounce the world are the best. You get the point. They're all the best, so to speak. They're all engaged in spiritual practice. But you can see now the harm that can come when you take a verse out of context. So without doubt, Sri Krishna says here that meditators are best. Does that mean that meditators are truly better than anyone else, better than other spiritual practitioners? You get the context now. This is the style of the Mahabharata. They call this style stuti. Stuti means praise. And the style used throughout the Mahabharata is whatever you are currently discussing, if it's praiseworthy, you have to praise it. So here in chapter 6, our topic has been meditation. So Sri Krishna is concluding the chapter appropriately by praising those who practice meditation. And Sri Krishna concludes here, Tasmat, therefore, O Arjuna, yogi bhava. You should be a yogi in this context. You should be a meditator. Therefore, Arjuna, you should practice meditation. Why? Meditation is best. But jnana, remember back in chapter 2, jnana is best. Back in chapter 3 on karma yoga is best. In chapter 5, sannyasa yoga, renunciation is best. And in chapter 12, bhakti yoga, devotion is best. You get the point. So it's not that meditation outshines all other spiritual practices, but here we have an instance of stuti, praise, the style of the Mahabharata. Leading us to the final verse of the chapter. Now, in the prior verse, Sri Krishna says that the yogi, the meditator, is the best among spiritual practitioners. But then we can ask the question, who is the best among meditators? Among spiritual practitioners, meditators are best. And among meditators, who is best? And that's what Sri Krishna addresses in this final verse. Yoginam api sarvesham, yoginam api sarvesham, madgatenantaratmana, madgatenantaratmana, shraddhavan bhajate yo mam, shraddhavan bhajate yo mam, same yuktatamo mataha, same yuktatamo mataha. So prior verse was considering all spiritual practitioners, and Sri Krishna says meditators are best. In this verse, Sri Krishna is considering all meditators. Yoginam api sarvesham. Sarvesham, among all yoginam, among all yogis, contextually, among all who practice meditation. Which are the best? Among those who practice meditation, who is best? Look at the third line. Those who, yaha, those who bhajate, worship, Sri Krishna says, mam. One who worships me, among all those meditators, the meditator who bhajate mam, who worships me, shraddhavan, full of faith, full of dedication, full of love, for Sri Krishna. So, yo mam bhajate, among all those meditators, the one who worships me, bhajate mam, shraddhavan, full of faith, back up to the second line, madgatena antaratmana, antaratmana, the one whose inner self, meaning mind or heart, the one whose mind or heart is madgatena. Mad is the pronoun I, me. So Sri Krishna says the one whose mind or heart is focused on me. What is he saying here? He says in the first line, yogi namapi sarvesham, among all meditators, yo mam bhajate, one who meditates on me, the one who worships me, shraddhavan, full of faith, madgatena antaratmana, with his or her mind and heart absolutely focused on me. Sri Krishna says, saha, in the last line, that person, me mataha, in my opinion, I consider that person yukta tamaha, the best of meditators, the best yogi. So, prior verse, among all spiritual practitioners, meditators are best. And this verse, among all meditators, those who meditate on Sri Krishna are best. Now, again, remember the context. Right from the beginning of the chapter, we said that Sri Krishna is teaching a particular meditation technique in this chapter in which the alambana, the focus of meditation, the object of meditation, is your inner divinity, which Sri Krishna says is his divine presence within you. So since that is the technique taught by Sri Krishna in this chapter, not surprisingly, he praises the meditators who follow his technique as being yukta tamaha, the best of all yogis. Final comment here. This one who meditates on me, that in the third line, bhajate yo mam, one who meditates on me, one who worships me, is the best. This little fragment is actually introducing the next chapter. This is the last verse of chapter 6, Dhyana Yoga. Chapter 7, Jnana Vijnana Yoga, is a chapter in which the focal point of the chapter is Sri Krishna himself. And we'll discuss. So there's rather a big transition between chapter 6 and chapter 7. We'll discuss in our next class. But the focus of the Gita is going to shift with chapter 7. The focus shifts to Sri Krishna, or in a broader sense to Ishvara, to God. So you can see then that this third line, one who worships me is best, is pointing to the following chapter in which Sri Krishna actually discusses and teaches his true nature. We'll see that in the last class. Since we're finishing chapter 6 on meditation, what we've been doing is to summarize the chapter very briefly. We've been reciting these English verses. The English verses, you remember, I composed following the meter of the original Sanskrit, so we can recite them like we recite the Sanskrit verses. The advantage of these English verses is they're also somewhat condensed, and we can recite them quickly and get the big picture, get an overview or a summary of chapter 6, which is what we will do right now. So for the first verse, you can listen and repeat so that you can remember the style of chanting. And then the following verses we can recite together. So first listen and repeat. The Blessed Lord said, The blessed Lord said, those who fulfill their duties here, those who fulfill their duties here, not impelled by the fruits of work, not impelled by the fruits of work, such yogis are renunciates, such yogis are renunciates, not those who merely forsake deeds, not those who merely forsake deeds. Good. Do you remember that the first portion of chapter 6 actually carries forth the subject matter from chapter 5? Chapter 5 was sannyasa, and for the first, I think, 9 verses of chapter 6, we see that topic carried forward. So just to remind you of why with our discussion on meditation comes only after a few verses. We'll see that as we continue. You can recite along with me now. When they are no longer attached to objects or experience, giving up all other pursuits, in yoga they have mastery. A yogi whose mind is fulfilled by this wisdom, by knowing God, looks the same way on everyone. Enemies, friends, sinners and saints, a yogi in deep solitude, whose mind and body are controlled, free from attachment and desire, should meditate upon the self, withdrawing to a wholesome place, neither too lofty nor too low, making a firm seat for oneself, cushioned by grass, deerskin, and cloth, fixing the mind on a single point, sense and thought movements all restrained. Seated there one should meditate for purity of mind and heart, head, neck, and body held erect, remaining steady, motionless, gazing toward the tip of the nose, looking not at anything else. The yogi meditating thus, whose mind is always well controlled, attains nirvana, perfect peace, in a state of union with me, like a lamp in a windless place, does not flicker, the same is true for yogis whose minds are controlled, meditating upon the self. When their thoughts have finally ceased, restrained by meditation strong, seeing the self with watchful minds, in the self they remain content, having attained that lofty state, no greater gain can they describe. Thus established they will remain, unshaken even by grave pain. So bit by bit withdraw your mind, firmly grasping the intellect. Fix your mind on the self alone, thinking not of anything else. Those who always meditate thus easily gain the highest bliss. They see the self in everything, and see everything in the self. Those who perceive me everywhere, and perceive everything in me, constantly abiding in me, such yogis are the best of all. Arjuna said, O Krishna, my mind wanders much, it's stubborn and impassioned too. I find it so hard to control, like trying to restrain the mind. The wind. The blessed Lord said, O Arjuna, it's hard indeed to restrain a wandering mind, but with practice and detachment, you can bring it under control. Arjuna said, those who from yoga fall away before they gain perfection here, do they not then become lost souls, stranded like isolated clouds? The blessed Lord said, not here nor in their later lives would their efforts ever be lost, because no one who strives for God shall to misfortune fall again. They might go to heavenly worlds and dwell in peace for countless years, or be reborn in a pious home. Such a birth here is rare indeed. Whatever wisdom they once held will be regained in later lives, then they shall continue again for perfection to further strive. The yogi, when cleansed of all sins, by effort and restraint of mind, gains perfection through many births, lastly reaching the goal supreme. And there we have a nice summary of the entire chapter. A lot was taught in chapter 6 and several different subject matters, of course, meditation being the primary subject matter. Next week, we begin our study of chapter 7, Jnana, Vijnana Yoga. I'll introduce it properly then. Next week also, we can resume our in-person classes. For the last few weeks, we have temporarily suspended our in-person classes because there's been a surge of the COVID virus. That surge, thank God, is over. So it is healthy and safe to come back to our ashram and resume attending classes in person. Of course, to come, you should be vaccinated and have received your booster. You'll also need to wear a mask indoors. We want to make sure that everyone who comes here is completely safe, pretty much as safe as you are at home. So please, if you live in the area, you can safely resume attending classes here starting next Saturday. Also, our satsang will resume. Our satsang question-answer format is now going to be held on the first and third Sunday of each month. I should mention that the Saturday class will meet next Saturday at 11 a.m. The satsang will meet Sundays at 6 p.m., but on the first and third Sundays at 6 p.m., which means not tomorrow, but a week from tomorrow, which will mean February 6th, Sunday, February 6th, will be our satsang will resume. Also, just mention that I'm currently working on a new video. The topic of the video is, does prayer really work? And it examines whether or not we can prove that prayer actually works. It's rather a challenging and interesting topic. I'm currently working on the video. I hope to publish it in the next few days. So you can look for that video on YouTube. If you want, you can subscribe to my channel on YouTube. That way you can be notified when that video is published. So next week we begin our study of chapter 7. We'll conclude now with our prayers. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Sadgamaya tamaso ma jyotirgamaya mrityorma hamritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat.